Welcome once again to Not a Fallacy, the show where I magically transform internet skeptics into apologists by arguing against their dogmatic faith and being more skeptical than they are. People generally believe that past experience gives them knowledge about future events, that present evidence gives them knowledge about past events, that sufficiently large random samples give them knowledge about the general population that the samples are drawn from, and other similar cases. All of the natural sciences depend on this type of reasoning, which is called inductive reasoning. But in An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, the 18th century skeptic David Hume claimed that all of the natural sciences are based on a logical fallacy, called the Induction fallacy. He pointed out that scientific claims assume but never prove that, for example, the future will resemble the present. Any evidence we ever gather about anything is not evidence about the future. It all comes from the present, and just because what was once the future resembled what was once the present does not tell us anything about what is actually in our future now, no matter how often it happens. Just because the sun has risen every morning so far does not by itself demonstrate that the sun won't explode and fail to rise tomorrow, and doesn't by itself even tell us anything about the probability that the sun won't explode and fail to rise by tomorrow, because we've never encountered tomorrow before to gather any data about tomorrow. The only way we can justify saying there's a low probability of the sun exploding and failing to rise tomorrow, or to make any scientific or probabilistic predictions at all, is by making the assumption that the future will resemble the past. There is no justification for that assumption. Trying to defend this on the grounds that the future has always resembled the past in the past is assuming the very thing that it is trying to prove. There is no justification for that assumption at all, and since all or nearly all scientific arguments depend on that assumption, all or nearly all scientific arguments are relying on an unjustified assumption, and therefore are unjustified, according to Hume. If you attempt to justify this, then you will quickly find that you are begging the question or engaging in circular reasoning, which is fallacious. In case anyone fails to notice the consequences if we follow this line of reasoning while holding to Clifford's rule that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for everyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence, then the result is that we must reject the natural sciences. Period. Oh no, science is in danger! To get around this, people, including scientists, charitably assume, based completely on faith with no justification at all, that the future will resemble the present for the purposes of scientific arguments. I am not interested in counter-arguments about this from people who are unfamiliar with Hume and his radical skepticism. Those in the audience who are basically familiar with the history of philosophy will know that Hume provided the basic outline for all, or nearly all, the epistemology propounded by popular atheists today. All that I have said so far is non-controversial, mainstream information in philosophy. But as a side note, I am shocked at how few self-described skeptics on the internet are familiar with David Hume. I am a Christian supernaturalist. It is not my job to defend Hume against skeptics. It should be the other way around. They should be using Hume's skepticism to attack me. This suggests to me a new argument I would call the argument from stupidity against the existence of God, which states, quote, "There must not be a God, because if there was a God, then there is no way he could create atheists this dumb," unquote. So far, apart from that side note with the little joke in it, we have dwelt only on common undergraduate philosophy information. It is only after this point that I start on what I personally think. I first want to propose an alternative definition for inductive reasoning. I would argue that inductive reasoning is valid and that all valid inductive reasoning can be defined as, quote, deductive reasoning with an inductive premise, unquote. That would be the faith-based assumption I mentioned earlier. The inductive premise is often stated as, the future is like the past, or the past was like the present, or the population is like the sample. It is the assumption that the state of things we haven't encountered will resemble the state of things we have encountered sufficiently that evidence gathered from the things we have encountered justifies drawing conclusions about things that we haven't actually encountered. A common example of inductive reasoning is our belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. We believe that the sun will rise tomorrow because it always has in the past. However, the conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow does not logically follow from the premise that the sun has always risen on every previous day without the induction premise that tomorrow will not be significantly different from previous days. That, for example, no internet supervillains like Rex Velvet or Milo Yiannopoulos will destroy the sun. So I have defined inductive reasoning as a subset of deductive reasoning. Understand that this part is my opinion, and is not how philosophers normally categorize things. Like as in all cases of deductive reasoning, the cases described by the term inductive reasoning are only as certain as their premises are, and induction premises are never completely certain. The inductive premise will always be only probabilistic, and therefore the conclusion of a valid inductive argument will also always be only probabilistic, which means that nearly every scientific conclusion will be only probabilistic. This solution seems very simple and elegant. One wonders why David Hume didn't think of it. But in fact, Hume did think of it, or something very like it, because spotting the induction fallacy did not preclude him from being a very strong advocate of the natural sciences. So what was he doing? How did he run into this anti-scientific nonsense about the induction fallacy? What he was doing was revealing an unstated or implicit faith-based assumption that scientific arguments depend on. He was making an abstraction from the full meaning of what a scientific claim involves to exclude a part of it which remains unstated or implicit. He then attacked scientific claims as committing a fallacy by only considering that abstraction and not considering the whole meaning of scientific claims, excluding the unstated or implicit part I have called the induction premise. Now, after having gone through all this, to go on insisting that we must reject a scientific claim on the grounds of it committing the induction fallacy is to ignore the induction premise, simply because it went unstated as too obvious to mention. But we can't always make every premise explicit in everything we say. It would take too long to say everything. We just have to keep in mind that whenever we make such an abstraction, as I have shown is involved in typical scientific claims, that it is part of the larger whole, which includes the induction premise. If you consider the relevant induction premises as part of scientific arguments, as I think you should, despite their usually remaining unstated when we formulate scientific arguments, then the natural sciences are not based on a logical fallacy. They are just relying upon a reasonable, faith-based assumption the way humans always do whenever they use words to mean things. This brings me to my main topic, the slippery slope alleged fallacy. My contention is that the typical slippery slope argument has a form that is not only valid, and not only sound, but often actually scientific. Just about any slippery slope argument which sounds even somewhat plausible can be pretty much guaranteed to come true, often immediately. Certainly the ones about sex have been coming true. The conservative argument on nearly every political issue is a slippery slope argument. Slippery slope is the essence of anti-progressivism in political philosophy argumentation. And the social conservatives who have been warning us about the moral degradation of society since at least the 1960s were right about everything. or at least close enough. Nowhere is this more evident than in the case of society's shifting attitudes about sex, marriage, and babies, or in other words, the only issues that actually matter. So I regard the claim that slippery slope is a fallacy to be corrupt political rhetoric meant to discredit conservatives, despite conservatives having reason, morality, and facts from real-world experience on their side, with a nearly perfect track record of being right about everything. How, then, do these objectors manage to sound credible describing slippery slope as a fallacy, despite slippery slope arguments coming true? They do it the same way David Hume managed to sound credible describing all of the natural sciences as a fallacy, because it is the same fallacy. Slippery slope arguments work on the faith-based assumption that the future is predictable according to patterns observed in the present, which is the same faith-based assumption on which is grounded all of modern science. If, to defend the sciences against Hume, you accepted that assumption there, then you must also accept that assumption here, because it's the same assumption. If we include the implicit induction premise as being part of the typical slippery slope arguments, then slippery slope arguments are just as valid as scientific arguments, and may even be scientific arguments, depending, of course, on your philosophy of science. Notice that I did not say just as sound as scientific arguments. I am attacking the view which holds that we should reject slippery slope arguments categorically as fallacious. You can still disagree with the particular inductive premise of a particular slippery slope argument without rejecting slippery slope arguments categorically, just as a believer in miracles can disagree with the particular inductive premise of a particular scientific argument without rejecting scientific arguments categorically, because that's what it would take for many slippery slope arguments to fail to come true. A miracle. If you agree with the gist of what I'm saying here, then I would like to see people in the comments adding examples of slippery slope arguments which have come true, especially from the 1950s to the present. Ideally, I'd like to see who was making the slippery slope argument, when they made it, and when it came true. There really should be a book on this. There's certainly enough material. There is one issue left to address, and that is the somewhat reasonable objection that the slippery slope fallacy only concerns arguments which lack causes or mechanisms for bringing about the change they predict. To respond to this, first of all, I must point out that such mechanisms are rarely missing when this alleged fallacy is referenced. The mechanism isn't missing, it's being ignored, sometimes actively, willfully ignored. Because, as a general anthropological rule, people are stupid, and at least some individuals are likely to do the stupidest possible thing. And if you bet on that, it usually won't let you down. Oh wait, we just found the supposedly missing mechanism. The missing mechanism is human stupidity. Anytime you hear a slippery slope argument and you're not sure what might bring about the change it suggests is happening, try adding "people are stupid, lazy, and selfish" as an implicit premise. Human stupidity, or at least fallibility, is a more than adequate mechanism to make most slippery slope arguments work just fine for the overwhelming majority of such arguments, and it is one of the most certain things in life. On the other hand, there may be a small minority of cases left where human fallibility does not apply. The mechanism may actually be missing in these cases, but it is not fair to describe these as slippery slope fallacy, as if all arguments based on accounts of decline were somehow fallacious. They're not, and this misnomer does a disservice to people's intelligence. It would be more fair to describe these as the missing mechanism fallacy, and to change the description so that it doesn't talk about slippery slopes as if they were an inherently invalid form of argument, and instead only talks about missing causal mechanisms. That would fix the problem I am pointing out, where people are abusing the name of this fallacy to dismiss valid opinions. But on a third hand, changing both the name and the description runs us into the Ship of Theseus problem. Is it really the same fallacy at that point? If we have to change both the name and the description, then we've replaced all the parts in the whole ship, and we might as well say that slippery slope is not a fallacy. By the way, it would be super ironic if in the comments people started saying, but if we change the name of slippery slope fallacy, then slippery slope arguments will be accepted, and if they're accepted, then some horrible consequence will result.